In an interview with Time magazine, Richard Dawkins, history's most overrated atheist, gave a challenge to religious people. When asked if a God exists, he said this: "Yes, but it could be any of a billion gods. It could be God of the Martians or of the inhabitants of Alpha Centauri. The chance of its being a particular God, Yahweh, the God of Jesus, is vanishingly small. At least, the onus is on you to demonstrate why you think that's the case." For sure, as long as humans have been around, we've been thinking about the idea of God. From our most ancient civilizations up until the modern day, we've been thinking not only about God, but what he might be like if he does exist. For our line of evidence, we're going to take a little investigation of a timeline of evidence. Now, Richard, it's taken me a while to get back to you, considering I was 8 years old when you issued your challenge, but prepare to see some evidence you may never have seen before. Let's go. For us Christians, we think that Jesus really is the Son of God, that he really is God in the flesh. But for critics, the chance of that is vanishingly small. And not only that, it seems unreasonable for God to have shown up 2,000 years ago and not in the modern day when we can just take a video of him. But there's actually evidence for why that had to be the case. Let's take a look at the first line of evidence: spirituality. There's a ton of ancient religions, both big and small, but if you survey what each one was saying about the divine, you start to see some patterns form. Here's 15 different characteristics common among ancient religious deity figures. Sometimes the deity was predicted. Zoroaster, for example, was apparently predicted since the beginning of time. And that would make sense for people who were thinking about God. At some point, they would expect that deity to exist, and so they'd predict him. In some mythologies, the deity is from a royal lineage. Take a look at many of the Greek and Roman gods, for example. It would make sense, too, that a god would be thought of as royal, because royalty is often associated with power and authority. Some deities are born unnaturally. Athena was said to be born from the head of Zeus, and the Tibetan god Indra was said to be born from the mouth of the god Purusha. This would make sense because people thinking about God would naturally expect him to have some kind of difference from humanity and to be special in some kind of way. A few mythologies have the deity being protected as a child. This was apparently the case with Buddha, who was protected from the ugliness of the world by his parents. This would also make sense. If people are thinking about God, they'd think he probably has at least some shared experiences with us. Some ancient deities faced temptation. Demons apparently tempted the god Krishna. This also makes sense. We'd expect this God to be able to relate to us in some way, and certainly we all face temptation. Sometimes ancient deities were identified as shepherds. In the ancient agrarian world, shepherds were very common. They were guides. And if these deities were supposed to be guides for us, well, then we'd naturally accept them as shepherds. Unsurprisingly, all the ancient deities are considered supernaturally powerful. This makes sense to people who look around us and see normal humans. If we expect some kind of God to exist, he's got to be more powerful than us, often supernaturally powerful, maybe even creating the entire world. In some mythologies, deities engage with humans directly. The Greeks and Romans knew this all too well. The deities who guide humanity would of course also teach them. God would naturally be a teacher of us because he would know things that we don't know, and so this would go along with him guiding humanity. He'd teach us things that we didn't previously understand. Many of the ancient deities were said to require sacrifice. Lots of thoughtful humans thought about the evil of this world, and they expected that the creator of the world would require some kind of sacrifice to make penance for the evil in this world, or to atone for it. Some of the ancient deities also faced trials of some kind. Dionysus, the Greek god, apparently faced trial at the hands of King Pentheus. This would also make sense to people thinking about God, because if God is supposed to be some kind of judge, then the judge should be consistent, even if it means judging themselves. A few mythologies depict a deity sharing a divine meal. The Persian god Mithras apparently shared a meal with Sol Invictus. We look at meals as ways to communicate intimately with one another, and so we'd probably want the same thing with God. We'd expect God to be able to intimately communicate with us, and so shared meals. Of course, many ancient deities had the power to defeat death. Some were considered immortal, so naturally they had the power over death. This makes sense as well, considering humans are mortal and we'd expect deities to have that power over something that we have no control over. Also, sometimes those death-defying deities offered that eternal life to their followers. Take Zalmoxis, for example, the god of the Dacians, who apparently offered eternal life to brave soldiers. This would make sense to people who are thinking about God and who understand death and have hope of overcoming that death. Lastly, some mythologies describe gods who judge the living and the dead. The Santal god Thakurjiu is said to have judged people before and after their deaths. This makes sense to people thinking about God because if evil is done on this earth, we'd expect it to be punished. If not on earth, then certainly after this life. Here's a chart of the deities I mentioned, plus a bunch more, and how they stack up against these common characteristics. Not all of the deities are described with all characteristics. In fact, none of them are. But you can see that there are still many similarities. These similarities are often brought up to discredit the Christian concept of Jesus, but we'll see how these actually work toward the person of Jesus. The deities with the most similarities to each other and Jesus are Osiris, Dionysus, Zoroaster, and Buddha. The first three are often used to undermine Jesus, saying that the Christians just copied him from earlier deities. But nobody really thinks that Jesus is a mythological recreation of Buddha, do they? Well, the same can be said for the other gods here. The similarities are too broad and too superficial to have any meaning. And besides, the only one that actually fulfills all of these characteristics is Jesus. Now for the really cool part. Oh, you thought that was it? No, it gets a lot cooler. We're just getting started. This is what I call the spiritual timeline, which is the main part of my argument. There are varying similarities among all of those gods I mentioned. So let's put them on a timeline and just see what happens. This is the timeline, roughly speaking, of the start and end of the worship of all of these deities. I'll start with Osiris, who is being worshipped from as early on as 3300 BC up until about 250 AD. Let's lay on top of that the timeline of Tammuz, the Mesopotamian god, to see if we can find a pattern starting. Then one by one, we're going to put layer after layer of deity worship and see what happens. This timeline goes up until the modern day, by the way, so we can say that this timeline represents the general summary of the expectations of humanity of the divine from the earliest worshipping of a god until now. You can see that the largest number of these deities with similar characteristics were being worshipped within the time span of 350 BC to 380 AD. So what? What's the importance? Well, don't you think, with all these people thinking about God over the course of many thousands of years, that eventually they'd realize some true things about God, and eventually that God would meet their expectations? Well, if that's the case, this window is a great time for something to happen, because all these people are worshiping God all at the same time. So let's call this the red zone. Something great is likely to happen here because of the spiritual overlap. Only one problem. This window is about 700 years long. That's way too broad. Well, that brings us to reason number 2 for why Jesus had to come 2,000 years ago. Culture. All of these spiritual groups were worshiping God in their own ways, but with similarities, all around the same time. Can we think of anything else interesting that happened in this period of history? Well, a certain empire took over the region and set the table for something interesting. Rome conquered most of the known world by 146 BC, certainly all the area around the Mediterranean. They built an amazing system of roads to connect the empire, which meant that people and information could travel a lot faster than any time previously. They adopted the Etruscan alphabet and the Greek language, making communication a lot faster as well. When Caesar Augustus rose to power, he implemented the cursus publicus, which is essentially the ancient version of the modern postal service. This helped spread information a lot faster, and it lasted until the end of the empire, centuries later. Lastly, Augustus initiated a time of peace called Pax Romana that also lasted for over 200 years. Now our red zone is a lot smaller. When you combine the general spiritual beliefs of the known world and the power and invention of the Roman Empire, you get a lot smaller window of history where something very interesting could take place. However, there's still a window of over 200 years in which the true God could potentially make himself known with maximum impact. Now let's look at reason number 3 for why Jesus had to come over 2,000 years ago. Prophecy. Of course, all the other deities are being worshipped by other people, but the Jews had some kind of concept of God as well. Now you might wonder, okay, great, we've got all these spiritual groups worshiping God back then, and yes, the Roman Empire was powerful, but why couldn't Jesus have just shown up today? Why couldn't we just take pictures of him and have him plaster his face on a billboard saying, I am God, worship me? Prophecy, that's why. The Jewish prophet Daniel said the Messiah would come after an edict to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and before the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. Well, there was a decree sent out by King Artaxerxes in 457 BC. And of course, everyone knows the temple was destroyed in 70 AD in the First Jewish-Roman War. All of a sudden, our red zone is extremely small. This timeline is over 5,000 years long, from 3300 BC to the 1900s in modern day. But we have a red zone that is 98 years long. That's from 29 BC, when Pax Romana began, up until 70 AD, when the Jewish temple was destroyed. Do you realize how small of a percentage of the timeline that is? That is 0.0188% of the timeline. I've expanded this timeline on the screen just to make it a little easier to see, but here's what it actually looks like as a percentage of history. It's a sliver. Even this doesn't do it justice. 0.0188% is nothing on this timeline. And yet, who happened to show up at this time? Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, yeah, sure, that's all well and good, you say, but maybe Jesus just kind of got lucky with his roll of the dice. Yeah, there's a lot of people worshiping God at the same time, and there's a strong economy and a strong empire in the Roman Empire, but that was over 2,000 years ago. Okay, great. You can imagine all this evidence leading up to this time as a fuse, and the time of Jesus, his appearance, is a bomb. So the fuse ends, the bomb goes off, and there's some kind of fallout, some kind of effect of the bomb. If he was nobody, really nobody, the fallout would be brushed under the rug and we'd forget about him. But do I really have to go over this part of the argument? We're talking about a nobody carpenter from one of the smallest nations on the face of the earth that hasn't existed for almost 2,000 years up until the 1940s. And yet we're trying to decide whether or not this carpenter was God. We shouldn't know about him, but yet there are believers from around the world who trust in the God of Israel because of him. That's something significant. I gotta be honest, Richard, I think this is all the evidence you need. You've got all these people worshiping God in a time where the region is really stable, and it would really do well for God to show up and fulfill some prophecy. And a guy shows up saying he fulfilled that prophecy and claiming to be God. And we're also talking about him 2,000 years later and legitimately considering his arguments. But hey, you might just want to be a cultural Christian like you said. That's totally fine. You don't have to worry about us because we're not going to crucify you for it.